Hi there, and welcome to Ku English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. Ferdinand de Saussure, the silent architect of modern language. Chapter 1. A quiet birth in Geneva. In the calm city of Geneva, Switzerland, on November 26, 1857, a baby boy was born into a family known for science and learning. His name was Ferdinand de Saussure. From the beginning, his world was full of books, quiet thinking, and conversations about the natural world. His father, Henri de Saussure, was a respected scientist, a mineralogist, and chemist who taught at the University of Geneva. Henri believed in careful observation and logical thinking, and this shaped how young Ferdinand saw the world. The de Saussure family had a long tradition of academic excellence. Even Ferdinand's grandfather had written about plants and nature. The house was filled with scientific instruments, rocks, maps, and books. It was not a noisy or playful home, but it was rich with knowledge. There were no loud games or wild parties. Instead, young Ferdinand grew up listening to quiet discussions about science, nature, and the universe. From a young age, Ferdinand showed signs of deep thought. He was not loud or attention-seeking. He often preferred to sit by himself, reading or thinking in silence. His eyes were full of curiosity, and his mind seemed always busy with questions. While other children played outside, Ferdinand would often be found inside, carefully studying a book or quietly asking his parents questions about the words people used and the reasons behind them. One story from his early childhood stands out. At the age of 7, Ferdinand was already fascinated by words. He would ask, "Why do we say tree and not something else?" His parents, though surprised, encouraged his interest. They did not laugh at his questions. They respected his serious thinking, even as a child. This early interest in words would later grow into one of the most important ideas in modern language studies. Ferdinand also showed a natural talent for languages. By the time he was 10, he had already started learning Latin and Greek, not because he had to, but because he was curious. He wanted to know how different languages expressed ideas and how they were connected. It wasn't just about learning to speak them, it was about understanding how they worked. His mother, Louise, who loved literature and poetry, helped him appreciate the beauty of words, while his father encouraged logical analysis. Ferdinand had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. Among them, he was known as the quiet one. His siblings often joked that Ferdinand seemed to live in his own world, a world filled with strange alphabets and maps of ancient places. But they also admired his memory. He could remember details from books he had read months earlier, and even though he did not enjoy small talk, when he spoke, his words were clear and thoughtful. His early school years were smooth. He was never the kind of student who caused problems. Teachers praised him for being attentive and hardworking. He was polite, punctual, and well-organized. But most importantly, he showed a strong desire to go beyond what the textbooks offered. While his classmates studied French grammar, Ferdinand was already comparing how grammar worked in Latin and Greek. He was, in many ways, far ahead of his age. At the age of 12, Ferdinand made a surprising decision. He told his parents he wanted to study all the Indo-European languages. These are the ancient language families that include Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and many modern European languages. Most children his age had never even heard of Indo-European languages. But Ferdinand was not like most children. His goal was not just to learn them, but to understand the deep structure that connected them. By age 14, he had begun learning Sanskrit, one of the oldest known written languages. It was difficult and full of strange rules. But to Ferdinand, it was a wonderful puzzle. He enjoyed breaking down the parts of words and seeing patterns. He would write notes in small letters, filling pages with charts and diagrams. He was building his own system for understanding how language worked. This passion did not go unnoticed. His teachers saw his unusual interest and helped guide him. One teacher even gave him access to university-level books. At that time, it was rare for someone so young to study such advanced material. But Ferdinand read each book with care and kept asking more questions. It was clear to everyone, his parents, teachers, and even his friends, that Ferdinand de Saussure was not just a good student, he was a young scholar in the making. He did not talk much, and he never tried to be the center of attention. But his ideas were deep, and his passion for language was strong. Behind his quiet face was a mind preparing to change how people thought about words, meaning, and communication. As he approached adulthood, one question began to grow inside him. What is the true nature of language? Not just how people speak, but what language really is beneath the surface. This question, born in a young boy's quiet mind in Geneva, would grow louder in the years to come. And through his journey, he would begin to build a new way of thinking about language that would affect everything from literature to philosophy, and even how we understand ourselves. Chapter 2. A young linguist in the making. By the time Ferdinand de Saussure turned 15, it was clear to everyone around him that he was no ordinary student. While most boys his age were concerned with social life or sports, Ferdinand spent his afternoons in the city library or at home surrounded by books. His shelves held volumes on Latin, Greek, Gothic, Old High German, and especially Sanskrit. He often stayed up late, copying grammatical structures by candlelight and comparing sound changes across languages. At school, his teachers began to treat him not just as a pupil, but almost as a colleague. His level of understanding was so advanced that he was allowed to work independently on special language projects. In one memorable moment, his Greek teacher admitted he had nothing more to teach Ferdinand and instead gave him a list of reading suggestions far beyond the standard curriculum. Ferdinand was not a show-off. He remained quiet, respectful, and focused. But his academic work quietly spoke for itself. One professor even said, "He is like a mirror. He reflects everything he reads and then adds something more." When Ferdinand turned 16, his father helped him enroll in advanced classes at the University of Geneva. This was unusual. He was still a teenager, but the university allowed it because of his exceptional ability. There, he attended lectures on classical languages, comparative grammar, and historical linguistics. He took careful notes, often more detailed than those of much older students. It was at this point that Ferdinand began to think more deeply about how languages change over time. He wasn't satisfied with simply learning grammar rules. He wanted to know why these rules existed. Why did words in Latin evolve differently in French and Italian, even though both languages came from the same root? Why did certain sounds shift in patterns across centuries? These questions led him into the heart of historical linguistics, a field focused on the origins and development of languages. But Ferdinand wanted more. He dreamed of studying in Leipzig, Germany, which at that time was one of the top centers for Indo-European studies. The University of Leipzig had famous professors like Georg Curtius and Karl Bruckmann, who were leaders in comparative philology. In 1876, at the age of 18, Ferdinand moved to Leipzig to begin his formal university studies. The move was not easy. Although he was fluent in several languages, living alone in a foreign country presented new challenges. He had to adjust to German academic customs, manage his own meals and living space, and take care of his health. But he did not complain. He threw himself into his studies with enthusiasm and discipline. At Leipzig, Ferdinand stood out immediately. While most students struggled with basic Sanskrit, he was already writing papers comparing Sanskrit with ancient Iranian and Slavic languages. His professors were astonished. One of them said, "He writes with the insight of a man twice his age." More importantly, Ferdinand was beginning to form his own theories, ideas that questioned the limits of traditional grammar and pointed toward a new understanding of language structure. At just 19 years old, Ferdinand wrote a remarkable essay titled Mémoire sur la systémie primitif des voyelles dans les langues Indo-Européennes, Memoir on the primitive vowel system in Indo-European languages. In this work, he proposed ideas about how vowels in ancient languages had evolved, ideas that were so advanced they would not be fully accepted until decades later. The paper was published in 1878, when he was only 21. This publication marked the first major step in Ferdinand's academic life. It brought him immediate respect among scholars. Some even believed that he might become the greatest comparative linguist of his generation. Yet, despite the praise, Ferdinand remained humble. He saw his work not as a finished product, but as the beginning of a larger search. He often said, "I am not interested in what is already explained. I want to understand what lies underneath." To him, the surface of language, the words we say and the rules we follow, was only part of the picture. He believed there was a deeper system, something hidden but powerful, that shaped how all languages functioned. During his time in Leipzig, Ferdinand also made close friendships with other young scholars. They would stay up late discussing language, history, and philosophy over coffee. Though quiet in large groups, Ferdinand came alive in one-on-one conversations. His thoughts were clear, his logic strong, and his passion contagious. Many classmates said they learned more from talking with him in private than from lectures in class. After 2 years at Leipzig, Ferdinand moved to the University of Berlin for further study. There, he attended lectures by leading figures in phonetics and general linguistics. His education was now truly international, combining Swiss precision, German discipline, and his own sense of curiosity. In 1880, at the age of 23, Ferdinand completed his doctoral degree. His dissertation focused on the use of the genitive case in Sanskrit, a highly specific and difficult topic. The quality of the work confirmed what many already believed. Ferdinand de Saussure was a brilliant young scholar, one who would shape the future of linguistics. But even at this point, he was restless. He had mastered many of the existing theories, but something still felt incomplete. There were questions about the system of language, about meaning, signs, and the relationship between thought and speech that had not been fully explored. These ideas would stay with him in the years ahead, and would eventually lead to a revolution in how people thought about language. As he packed his books and said goodbye to Berlin, Ferdinand was stepping into a new phase of life. He had left his childhood behind, completed a world-class education, and published a work that would challenge experts for years. But in his heart, he knew the journey was only beginning. Chapter 3. The Teacher Who Questioned Everything. In 1881, shortly after completing his doctorate in Berlin, Ferdinand de Saussure returned to Switzerland. Though only 24 years old, he was already considered a rising star in the world of linguistics. Scholars across Europe knew his name, thanks to his earlier work on the vowel system in Indo-European languages. However, rather than continuing a purely academic life in Germany, Ferdinand chose a different path. He accepted a position at the University of Geneva as a lecturer in historical linguistics. At first, this seemed like a safe, even modest, choice. Geneva was his hometown, and the university there was not as famous as those in Germany or France. But Ferdinand had his own reasons. He wanted time to think, to read, and to teach in his own way. He was beginning to see teaching not just as a job, but as a laboratory, a place where ideas could be tested, questioned, and refined. His students were often surprised by his lectures. Unlike other professors who followed fixed textbooks, Ferdinand would open class with questions. What is a word, he might ask? Is it just a sound, or something more? He wanted his students to think deeply, to examine assumptions they had never questioned before. One student later recalled, "He spoke softly, but every sentence had weight. He made us feel as though language was not a set of rules to memorize, but a living system to understand." At the same time, Ferdinand continued his research. He published several short papers on topics such as sound change, word formation, and the history of specific languages. However, he wrote less than many expected. Part of this was due to his teaching load, but another reason was more personal. Ferdinand was no longer satisfied with traditional linguistic research. He felt that the field was missing something essential. The more he taught, the more he realized that the tools used by most linguists like sound laws and grammar patterns were not enough. These methods described language after it had changed, but they didn't explain what language was. Ferdinand began to suspect that there was a hidden structure behind all languages, a system deeper than history or sound. He once told a colleague, "We study words, yet we do not know what a word is. We trace origins, but we do not ask why language works as it does in the first place." This dissatisfaction led him into a kind of quiet revolution. While teaching traditional topics like Sanskrit grammar or Latin roots, he began collecting notes on a new kind of linguistics, one that focused not on the history of words, but on the structure of meaning. These notes, written in private notebooks, would become the seeds of his future masterpiece. During these years, Ferdinand also formed relationships that shaped his thinking. He met Charles Bailly and Albert Secchi, two young scholars who would later play important roles in developing and preserving his ideas. With them, he discussed the limits of existing theories and dreamed of a linguistics that could explain not just the past of language, but its present and even its logic. Outside of academia, Ferdinand remained a quiet and modest man. He never sought fame and avoided public debate. He loved walking by the lake, spending hours reading alone, and visiting his family regularly. Though deeply thoughtful, he did not isolate himself. Instead, he believed that real ideas came not from shouting but from reflection. One story tells of him helping a struggling student after class. Rather than correcting the student's mistakes directly, he asked guiding questions until the student discovered the error on his own. "Teaching," he said later, "is not the giving of answers, but the shaping of minds." By the late 1880s, Ferdinand's reputation in Geneva was solid. His classes were well attended, and younger scholars looked to him for advice. But he remained somewhat of a mystery. Unlike other academics who published widely to build their careers, Ferdinand seemed content to publish little and think deeply. This quiet period of teaching and reflection was essential. It allowed him to observe language in its natural form, not just in books, but in how people used words every day. He paid attention to how meaning changed with context, how the same word could mean different things in different situations, and how languages followed patterns that were not always obvious. More and more, he was drawn to the idea that language was a system of signs. A sign, he believed, was made of two parts: the signifier, the sound or written form of a word, and the signified, the concept or meaning behind it. This simple idea would later become one of the most important concepts in modern linguistics and philosophy. But at this point, it was still forming in his mind, taking shape slowly like a photograph developing in a darkroom. He was not ready to publish it. Not yet. He believed that rushing ideas into print could kill them before they were fully born. So, he waited, he taught, he thought, and he prepared. In 1891, after 10 years of teaching in Geneva, Ferdinand accepted a new position at the École pratique des hautes études in Paris. This marked another turning point in his life, a return to a larger academic stage, and a step closer to the revolutionary ideas he would one day share with the world. But even as he packed for Paris, Ferdinand was still asking the same quiet question that had driven him since he was a boy. What is language? Really? He did not yet have a full answer, but he knew he was getting closer. Chapter 4: Paris, Puzzles, and the Search for Order. When Ferdinand de Saussure arrived in Paris in 1891, he entered a city full of movement and intellectual excitement. The late 19th century was a time of great change. New theories in psychology, literature, and science were challenging old ways of thinking. Paris, as always, was at the center of this cultural energy. Saussure took up a post at the prestigious École pratique des hautes études, where he would teach courses in Indo-European languages, Gothic, and Old High German. Though still focused on historical linguistics, he was now surrounded by some of the most brilliant minds in Europe. Yet again, Ferdinand chose a quieter path. Instead of chasing fame or publishing controversial ideas, he listened, observed, and refined his thoughts. Despite the bustling academic atmosphere, Saussure remained calm and reserved. He did not try to impress people. Instead, he impressed them without trying, through clarity of thought, originality, and his unusual ability to notice what others missed. In the classroom, his students began to notice something unique about his teaching. He would often ask questions that made them pause. What do we mean when we say two words mean the same thing? He once asked, "What is meaning anyway?" While his official role was to teach ancient languages, Saussure quietly pursued another goal: understanding the hidden systems behind language. He believed that all languages, despite their surface differences, followed certain universal rules, rules that no one had yet written down. The puzzle of language, for him, was not just about history, it was about structure, relationships, and patterns of thought. Ferdinand's mind worked differently from most of his colleagues. Where others saw language as a chain of events, he saw a web of relations. He started using metaphors to describe this web. Language, he would say, is like a game of chess. The pieces gain value through their position, not by themselves. This idea that meaning is based on contrast and structure, not on isolated words, was radical for the time, yet Saussure shared it only in private conversations or personal notes. He did not publish it. He was still building the foundation, testing the logic, and working towards something greater than any single paper. During these years in Paris, Saussure lived a rather private life. He read widely, from ancient texts to modern philosophy. He paid close attention to the new sciences of psychology and anthropology. He even explored poetry and music, trying to understand how signs and meaning worked beyond spoken words. He also began writing down his ideas more carefully, keeping a growing number of notebooks. These were not typical research journals. Instead of recording data, Saussure wrote reflections, philosophical, technical, and sometimes poetic thoughts about language. He asked himself questions like, can language exist without thought? Is the link between word and meaning natural or arbitrary? What happens when a word loses its meaning? Each question opened up new paths. Slowly, he began developing concepts that would later become core to structural linguistics. One such concept was the arbitrariness of the sign. The idea that the connection between a word like tree and its meaning, the concept of a tree, is not natural, but made by social agreement. This was a revolutionary thought. If signs were arbitrary, then meaning was not fixed by nature. It was shaped by human systems. Language was not just a mirror of reality, it was a structure that helped create reality. Yet again, he did not publish. Many friends and colleagues encouraged him to put his ideas into a book, but Saussure held back. He feared that without proper clarity, his ideas might be misunderstood. He was, in a way, a perfectionist, not of presentation, but of precision. Outside of academia, Saussure remained close to his family. He returned to Geneva often, especially during school breaks. His mother, who had always supported his intellectual life, was growing older, and Ferdinand made sure to visit her regularly. He enjoyed quiet walks, simple meals, and time with his brothers. These moments reminded him of his roots and helped balance the abstract intensity of his academic world. In 1894, Saussure married Marie Fesch, the daughter of a respected Geneva family. She was intelligent, calm, and supportive. Their relationship was built on quiet respect rather than dramatic passion. With her, Saussure found emotional stability. They would go on to have children, and Ferdinand often helped with family duties despite his academic commitments. Even as his personal life grew, Saussure's thoughts about language deepened. In Paris, he started to outline what he called a general linguistics, a new field that would focus not just on how language changes over time, but how it functions at any given moment. He started referring to this idea in contrastive terms: diachronic, study of language over time; synchronic, study of language at a fixed point in time. This distinction was a turning point. Before Saussure, most linguists focused on how languages evolved. He was among the first to argue that we must also study how languages work right now, like a system frozen in time. This synchronic approach would eventually become a foundation of modern linguistics. By the late 1890s, Saussure was ready to return to Geneva. The University of Geneva invited him to take a senior teaching position, and he accepted. Paris had given him new tools, deeper questions, and a clearer sense of purpose. But he longed for the quiet thinking space of home. He knew he still had much to develop. As he left Paris, one of his students reportedly asked, "Will you write a book?" Saussure only smiled and said, "Not yet. It is not finished." What he didn't know was that his greatest influence would come after his death, not through a book he wrote, but through the words others would gather from his lectures and notes. For now, he carried his notebooks and dreams back to Geneva. The foundation was set. The deeper questions had been asked, and the next chapter of his life, the one that would plant the seeds of structuralism, was about to begin. Chapter 5: Homecoming and the Hidden Blueprint of Language. Ferdinand de Saussure returned to Geneva in 1900. At 43 years old, he was no longer a rising scholar. He was a mature thinker with a quiet confidence and an extraordinary vision. Though not widely famous, he was deeply respected by colleagues who knew the depth of his intellect. He accepted a professorship at the University of Geneva. His official title was Professor of Sanskrit and Indo-European Languages, but everyone knew his mind ranged far beyond ancient roots and dead scripts. This return to his homeland was not a retreat. It was a return to the ideal conditions for thought, stability, quiet, and deep focus. His lectures at the university began as standard lessons in historical linguistics. Yet students soon noticed that something else was happening. Saussure would pause in the middle of a lecture and ask, "What is a word? Or does sound carry meaning by itself?" These were not usual questions for a course on Old High German. He was no longer satisfied with simply tracing the history of words. Instead, he was asking what made language possible in the first place. Saussure believed that the field of linguistics had become too focused on external change, sound shifts, grammar evolution, vocabulary drift over time. What was missing, in his view, was a theory of structure, a way to describe how language worked as a complete system at any one moment. He began to sketch out what he called a science of language, not just the study of individual languages, but of the rules and systems that governed all human communication. Structure and system, a new framework. At the heart of this vision was a pair of revolutionary ideas. First was the concept of language as a system of signs. A sign, he explained, is made up of two parts: the signifier, the sound or written form of a word like the sound of tree; the signified, the concept or idea. The word points to the mental image of a tree. Together, they make a sign, and the connection between them is arbitrary. There is no natural reason why the word tree should represent a tree. It just does, because that's how people have agreed to use it. This insight led to his second key idea. Signs only have meaning because of their relationship to other signs. In other words, words don't mean something because of what they are. They mean something because of what they are not. The word black only makes sense because it contrasts with white. Father makes sense because of mother, child, or son. Language is a web of contrasts, not a list of labels. These ideas were powerful. They suggested that meaning in language wasn't fixed or absolute. It was fluid, created by a system of differences. And Saussure didn't stop there. He introduced several pairs of concepts that would become central to the study of language. Langue versus parole. Langue refers to the structured system of a language shared by a community. Parole is the individual use of language, what people actually say. He argued that linguistics should focus on langue, the underlying structure. Synchronic versus diachronic. Synchronic linguistics studies language at a fixed point in time. Diachronic linguistics studies how language changes over time. Saussure insisted both were important, but that synchronic analysis had been badly neglected. These concepts formed the skeleton of what we now call structural linguistics. But at the time, Saussure did not publish them. Instead, he shared them in lectures, slowly, carefully, almost reluctantly. The classroom as laboratory. Between 1906 and 1911, Saussure taught 3 special courses in general linguistics at the University of Geneva. These lectures were unlike anything his students had encountered before. Instead of lists of historical word changes, Saussure invited them to consider what made language work at all. He brought diagrams, drew grids on the chalkboard, and explained how even simple oppositions, like hot versus cold, were part of a broader structure of meaning. His students were fascinated and often challenged. The ideas were abstract, but Saussure had a way of making them feel necessary, even urgent. One student later recalled, "He made you feel as though the mystery of thought itself was passing through words." Yet Saussure was still uncomfortable putting his new theories into print. He felt they were not finished. He revised constantly, crossing out pages of notes and replacing them with new sketches. He told students that language was too slippery, too complex to capture in a single theory, but he never stopped trying. At home, he remained a loving husband and father. He would sometimes take long walks by Lake Geneva, notebook in hand, lost in thought. Friends described him as calm and modest, but also deeply intense beneath the surface. His mind was always working. His health, however, began to decline. He suffered from fatigue, headaches, and what we might now recognize as stress-related illness. Yet he continued to teach, and his third and final general linguistics course in 1910-1911 Wald proved to be his most influential. After that final course, Saussure retired from teaching. He died just 2 years later, in 1913, at the age of 55. He left behind a few published works, dozens of notebooks, and hundreds of students who had heard, but not yet fully grasped, the depth of his ideas. What happened next would change the history of language forever. Chapter 6. The Silent Revolution, a book that changed everything. Ferdinand de Saussure passed away in 1913, leaving behind more questions than answers. He had not published his grand theory of language. There was no single book where his vision could be found. To many outsiders, he remained the expert on Indo-European roots and vowel shifts, not the founder of a new science. But his students knew better. Among them were Charles Bailly and Albert Secquet, two devoted listeners who had attended Saussure's final courses at the University of Geneva. They had taken detailed notes and preserved not only what Saussure said, but often how he said it, his diagrams, comparisons, and careful choice of terms. In the years after his death, they gathered Saussure's notebooks, consulted with other former students, and began assembling what would become a silent revolution course in general linguistics, Cours de linguistique générale, published in 1916. A book without an author. What made this book extraordinary was not just its content, it was its form. It was not written by Saussure himself. Instead, it was a reconstruction based on his spoken lectures, edited and interpreted by his students. This unusual authorship raised questions. Could a theory built from memory and lecture notes truly represent the thinker's mind? Bailly and Secquet believed it could, and they were careful to indicate where they added interpretations or had to fill in gaps. Despite these challenges, the course read like a coherent, elegant framework. Its central claim was both simple and radical. Language is not a naming system for things. It is a structured system of signs. This structure was social, not personal. It existed in the collective mind of a language community, not inside individual speakers. Language was not merely a tool, it was a system of systems, shaping how people thought and how they made meaning. The book presented key concepts that would later become fundamental in linguistic studies. The arbitrariness of the sign, the idea that there is no natural connection between words and their meanings. The relational nature of language, meaning arises through contrast with other signs, not in isolation. The priority of structure over content. What matters most is not what a word means, but how it functions within the system. These ideas were not just linguistic, they were philosophical. They suggested that truth, meaning, and even identity were shaped by structure, not by fixed essence. Saussure had opened the door into a new way of thinking. A quiet impact begins. At first, the course received modest attention. It was written in French, published during World War I, and its subject seemed highly technical. But in intellectual circles, especially in Europe, it began to circulate. By the 1920s and 1930s, a new generation of scholars began to notice its power. In Prague, A group of linguists known as the Prague Circle adopted Saussure's ideas and expanded them. They explored how sounds, syntax, and grammar formed interconnected systems. To them, language was not an accident of history, it was an engine of logic and culture. In Russia, thinkers like Roman Jakobson took up Saussure's challenge to view language synchronically as a structure at a moment in time. They saw patterns not only in language, but in poetry, narrative, and even politics. Across Europe, the course became a hidden blueprint. Philosophers, literary theorists, anthropologists, and even psychologists began to adapt Saussure's concepts. Though he had never intended to be a revolutionary, Saussure's legacy was now growing across borders and disciplines. Structuralism, the idea that everything is language. The term structuralism came to define the movement inspired by Saussure's ideas. In structuralism, language was the key to understanding not just speech, but all human meaning-making, myths, stories, rituals, and even fashion. The idea was that all cultural expressions could be analyzed like language, as systems of signs that functioned through difference and opposition. Claude Lévi-Strauss used Saussure's concepts to study kinship and myth in anthropology. Roland Barthes applied them to literature and everyday life. Jacques Lacan used Saussure's sign system to reinterpret Freud's psychoanalysis. All these thinkers believed in a common principle, that the surface of culture hid deep structures, rules, and oppositions we unconsciously followed. And at the foundation of all this was the work of a quiet linguist from Geneva, who had died before he saw what his lectures would become. A book ahead of its time. Even decades later, the course in general linguistics remains a challenging text. Its language is precise but abstract. It demands attention, reflection, and sometimes rereading. Yet it rewards those who persist. For learners of English and of language itself, the course offers more than just ideas. It trains the mind to think relationally, to see patterns, to question assumptions. It is a book that teaches how to see language not just as vocabulary, but as a living, moving system. For Saussure, language was not merely a tool of communication, it was the condition for thought, the medium through which human beings could make sense of the world. He once wrote, "Language is a form, not a substance," and in that short phrase lies a universe of meaning. The quiet revolution he began through his lectures, his notes, and finally through the course would echo into every corner of the humanities in the 20th century. The man who never published his theory in his lifetime became the father of modern linguistics, and more than that, the unintentional architect of an intellectual transformation. Chapter 7. Beyond Words. Saussure's Ideas in the Modern Mind. Ferdinand de Saussure never imagined his theories would escape the walls of linguistics. He did not consider himself a philosopher, nor did he aim to change the way people understood culture or thought. Yet that is exactly what happened, after the posthumous publication of Course in General Linguistics. Saussure's ideas began a slow but powerful journey into the wider world of the humanities. His concepts of structure, difference, and systems of signs captured the imagination of thinkers in literature, anthropology, psychoanalysis, and philosophy. They began to ask, if language is a system of signs, what about other human activities? Could myths, narratives, dreams, and social customs also be read as if they were languages? The answer was yes, and from that answer grew a new intellectual movement, structuralism. Anthropology as language. Claude Lévi-Strauss. The French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss was among the first to see the full power of Saussure's ideas beyond linguistics. Lévi-Strauss studied kinship systems and tribal myths among indigenous peoples in South America. These myths, to many observers, seemed random or poetic, but Lévi-Strauss looked deeper. He saw that behind these stories were rules and oppositions, such as nature versus culture, raw versus cooked, male versus female. To him, these oppositions were not just content, they were the structure of human thinking. Myths worked like language. They formed systems. They made meaning through difference, just like Saussure's signs. By applying structuralist analysis to myths, Lévi-Strauss showed that the human mind is fundamentally structured, and that this structure reveals itself, even in the most ancient or remote cultures. Literature and semiotics. Roland Barthes. In Paris, another thinker was listening to Saussure's echo. Roland Barthes. He began by applying structuralism to literature, asking, how do we understand texts? What gives a story meaning? For Barthes, every story, like every language, followed a structure. Characters, events, and symbols worked together like a network of signs. A hero was meaningful because of the villain. A journey was meaningful because of the return. Barthes expanded Saussure's ideas into semiotics, the study of signs in general. He examined not just books, but also advertisements, films, clothing, and even food. To him, modern culture was a giant language. Everything we do and see can be analyzed as a system of signs. In his famous essay, The Death of the Author, Barthes claimed that meaning does not come from the writer's intention, but from the reader's interpretation, echoing Saussure's idea that signs function through collective usage, not individual creation. Psychoanalysis and language. Jacques Lacan. In the field of psychology, the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan brought Saussure into the world of the unconscious. Lacan argued that the unconscious is structured like a language. He believed that the way we dream, desire, and suffer follows patterns similar to those of Saussurean linguistics. Desires are shaped not by nature, but by symbols and structures we absorb from language and culture. This was a bold idea. Freud had seen the unconscious as full of instincts and drives. Lacan, inspired by Saussure, saw it as a linguistic structure, a place of signs, substitutions, and oppositions. This shift changed psychoanalysis from a theory of inner conflict to a theory of language-based identity. Philosophy. Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. Structuralism also entered the world of philosophy. Thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida began to explore how knowledge, truth, and even power were produced by systems of signs. Foucault looked at how societies create truth through discourse, structured ways of talking and thinking that shape what is considered normal or scientific. Like Saussure, he saw knowledge not as a mirror of reality, but as a product of structures. Derrida, on the other hand, pushed Saussure's ideas to their limits. He took the idea of difference and argued that meaning is never fixed. Every sign refers to another sign. There is no final meaning, only endless deferral. Derrida called this process deconstruction, a method of reading that exposes hidden assumptions in texts and ideas. For him, Saussure's insight that meaning comes from difference was just the beginning. Language, in Derrida's view, was not a stable structure. It was a shifting play of signs. From language to culture, by the 1970s, structuralism had become a major intellectual force across Europe and even in the United States. Universities began teaching Saussure's concepts not just in linguistics, but in literature, sociology, anthropology, and cultural studies. His terminology, signifier, signified, long parole, entered the vocabulary of educated readers around the world. And yet, many of these developments went far beyond what Saussure himself had written or intended. He had laid the foundation, but others built the tower. He had provided the lens, but others changed the view. This broad application of his theories, often controversial, showed just how powerful his ideas were. They were flexible, generative, and deeply challenging. Saussure had taught that language was a social structure governed by relations, not substances. His intellectual heirs extended that insight to the entirety of human life. The unintended architect, Ferdinand de Saussure, never attended these discussions. He died before his influence truly began. He published no popular books. He avoided public debates. He stayed in Geneva, teaching quietly, thinking deeply. And yet, his lectures lit a fire that reshaped 20th century thought. His students wrote down his words. His readers extended his theories. His critics sharpened their arguments against him. Without trying, Saussure became the unintended architect of modern thought. His insight that meaning is relational, that structure defines function, and that systems shape understanding remains as relevant today as it was a century ago. Chapter 8. The Quiet Decline. Fading Light in Geneva. Ferdinand de Saussure had spent much of his life in silence, not the silence of disinterest, but the deep quiet of thought. He was a man of precision, careful with words, cautious in publishing, and often troubled by the imperfections of expression. His theories were bold, but his personality remained modest, almost hidden behind the curtain of his classroom. As the new century moved forward, Saussure's own energy began to fade. By the early 1900s, health concerns began to interrupt his routines. He had always been somewhat frail, but now he experienced recurring bouts of fatigue, difficulty breathing, and chronic migraines. Geneva's cool air and peaceful pace were no longer enough to restore him. A mind that would not rest. Though his body weakened, Saussure's mind remained restlessly active. He continued teaching, though his lectures became shorter and less frequent. His students still gathered eagerly, hanging on to every phrase, scribbling notes with the sense that they were witnessing something rare. But Saussure was never satisfied with what he said, not fully. He constantly revised his materials, reorganized topics, and corrected earlier notes. He believed his ideas about language were incomplete, perhaps even impossible to finish. He once wrote to a colleague, "I live in a permanent state of dissatisfaction. Language refuses to sit still long enough for me to capture it." His lectures were a mix of brilliance and frustration. Some days, he lit the room with conceptual clarity. Other days, he paused mid-sentence, unsure whether his words had caught the idea he had in mind. For Saussure, language was both his tool and his opponent. He spoke to his family of a book I must one day write, but that book never came. Family, solitude, and inner doubt. At home, Saussure lived a quiet, respectful life. He was not cold, but he kept a certain emotional distance. His wife, Louise, managed the household and cared for their children. She understood his rhythms, his long walks, his tendency to lose track of time, his need for silence. He was a loving father in his own way, though he rarely spoke at length about emotions. His love was shown in gestures, a hand on the shoulder, an afternoon spent exploring nature with his sons, the occasional book he selected for them with care. But inwardly, he was often troubled. He questioned the value of his work, wondered if he had truly contributed anything lasting, and feared he would be forgotten. This self-doubt, so unlike the clarity of his theories, haunted his later years. Geneva offered little distraction. It was peaceful, but perhaps too peaceful for a man with such an unsettled mind. His walks grew slower, his lectures rarer, he read more and spoke less. His health continued to decline. The final years. By 1909, Saussure had largely stopped lecturing. He focused on compiling notes, reviewing his older work, and at the encouragement of colleagues, trying to organize his lectures into a manuscript. But the task overwhelmed him. The ideas were too vast, the details too fine. He left behind hundreds of pages of handwritten notes, sketches, definitions, and diagrams, but no finished book. To outsiders, it seemed as if he had chosen silence over speech. In 1911, his condition worsened. Diagnosed with what was likely a form of nervous exhaustion or undiagnosed cancer, Saussure became increasingly confined to his home. He still read, still wrote in brief bursts, but he no longer went out to walk by the lake or visit the university. Friends and former students came to visit. Some brought flowers, others brought questions about language and meaning, questions they felt only he could answer. He smiled, responded politely, but gave few answers. "I've said all I can," he told one visitor. "The rest is for others to work out." On February 22, 1913, Ferdinand de Saussure passed away at the age of 55. His death was quiet, like much of his life. Geneva mourned him gently. There were no grand announcements. No international newspapers carried headlines. To most of the world, he died unknown. The quiet before the storm. What Saussure did not know was that the real impact of his work had only just begun. In the years following his death, two of his former students, Charles Bally and Albert Secquet, began sorting through his lecture notes. They remembered the intensity of his teaching, the sharpness of his definitions, and the elegance of his distinctions. They believed the world needed to see his ideas. Working carefully, they organized the fragments into a single volume, Course in General Linguistics, Cours de Linguistique, General, published in 1916. The book did not appear revolutionary at first, but soon, readers across Europe began to realize its depth. It offered a new way to understand language, not just as a tool for communication, but as a system that shapes how we think. Linguists, philosophers, anthropologists, and writers began quoting Saussure. They debated his terms. They questioned his assumptions. They expanded his vision. Ironically, the man who had feared being forgotten was about to become the most quoted linguist of the 20th century. Chapter 9, The Legacy Awakens. Saussure's Voice Beyond the Grave. Ferdinand de Saussure passed away in 1913 with little fanfare. There were no awards, no honorary tributes, no grand statements about his intellectual contributions. His grave in Geneva stood quiet, like the man himself. But in 1916, 3 years after his death, something remarkable happened. His voice returned, clearer, sharper, and louder than ever before. His former students, Charles Bailly and Albert Secquet, had collected his notes from the lectures he gave between 1906 and 1911. They remembered how those lectures had transformed their understanding of language. Working together, they edited and arranged the scattered papers into a book. They titled it Course in General Linguistics. A book born from fragments, the book was not written by Saussure himself. Instead, it was a careful reconstruction of his ideas. Bailly and Secquet used student notes, personal letters, and the few outlines Saussure had left behind. They did not add their own ideas, but tried to preserve the spirit of his teaching. It was a risky project. The book could have been ignored, misunderstood, or even rejected. But something about Saussure's thinking caught the world's attention. The course introduced a new way of thinking about language, one that was systematic, structural, and deeply philosophical. It offered tools, not rules. It showed that language was not a simple mirror of the world, but a complex network of signs shaped by human thought. For the first time, linguists were asked to look not just at words, but at relationships between words and how meaning was created through opposition, structure, and context. The rise of structuralism. As the book spread through academic circles, a new movement began to form. Structuralism. It started in linguistics, but it did not stay there. Philosophers, anthropologists, psychoanalysts, and literary critics all found something useful in Saussure's ideas. They were particularly fascinated by several key concepts. The signifier and the signified. Every word connects a sound signifier to a concept signified. But the relationship is arbitrary. There's no natural reason why the word tree means a tall plant with leaves. It's a cultural convention. Language as a system of differences. Words don't have meaning in isolation. They gain meaning through difference from other words. For example, hot is understood in contrast to cold. Langue and parole. Saussure separated langue, the structured system of a language, from parole, individual, speech acts. This distinction helped scholars study language more scientifically. These ideas helped scholars see language not as a chaotic collection of sounds and grammar rules, but as a structure with its own logic, something that could be analyzed like a machine or a mathematical system. Influence beyond linguistics. In the decades that followed, Saussure's concepts moved far beyond the study of language. In France, his ideas inspired Claude Lévi-Strauss, the father of structural anthropology. Lévi-Strauss studied myths and kinship systems, seeing human culture as a web of symbolic relationships. In psychoanalysis, Jacques Lacan reinterpreted Freud using Saussurean linguistics, arguing that the unconscious is structured like a language. In literature, Roland Barthes and Severin Todorov used structuralist tools to explore how stories, genres, and meanings are built. Saussure's influence was also present in semiotics, the study of signs, where scholars like Umberto Eco examined how humans produce and interpret signs in everything from fashion to film. His name, once almost unknown, now appeared in academic texts, conference talks, and university syllabi. Students were taught to understand literature, society, and even the human mind through structures, thanks to a man who never published a major book during his lifetime. By the 1960s and 70s, Saussure's course in general linguistics had been translated into many languages. His theories were debated in classrooms from Tokyo to New York, from Berlin to Buenos Aires. Some scholars praised him as a visionary. Others criticized his ideas as too abstract or rigid. Yet, even his critics admitted that he had changed the way we think about communication. He had given the world a new intellectual lens, one that allowed us to see the hidden structures behind everyday speech, culture, and thought. This global recognition came decades after his quiet death. He never witnessed the influence he had. He never saw how his ideas would become part of the foundation of modern linguistics and theory. Still, perhaps that would have pleased him. After all, Saussure believed that meaning exists not in the individual, but in the system, not in the speaker, but in the structure of the language itself. His legacy, like his theory, was less about the man and more about the framework he left behind. Chapter 10. The Unfinished Dialogue, Reinterpreting Saussure in the Modern Age. Ferdinand de Saussure never imagined he would become one of the most cited thinkers of the 20th century. He died quietly in 1913, unaware that his classroom lectures would not only shape modern linguistics but also send ripples through nearly every field in the humanities. Yet today, more than a century later, his ideas are still debated, challenged, and reimagined. Saussure is no longer just a name in a textbook. He is a central figure in an ongoing conversation about how humans create, use, and interpret meaning. After the initial rise of structuralism in the 1950s and 60s, Saussure's theories continued to evolve, not because he added new ideas, but because others re-examined his work in light of new discoveries and social changes. Some scholars began to question the limits of his theories. Post-structuralists, such as Jacques Derrida, argued that Saussure's neat system of signs was too stable and too tidy. They believed that meaning was always shifting, that language was filled with gaps, ambiguities, and contradictions. In his famous critique of grammatology, Derrida challenged the very foundation of Saussure's idea that speech was primary and writing secondary. He showed how writing, far from being a simple representation of speech, could influence and reshape the way we think and communicate. This post-structuralist approach didn't reject Saussure. It deepened the conversation. It asked, can language ever fully express thought? Can a word ever mean exactly the same thing in two different contexts? What happens when signs break down or when cultures use the same word in different ways? Rather than weakening Saussure's position, these questions expanded his influence into new areas of study across the humanities. In philosophy, Saussure's ideas influenced discussions on truth, reality, and interpretation. Thinkers like Michel Foucault used his structural model to analyze the systems behind knowledge and power. In cultural studies, scholars applied Saussurean semiotics to everyday objects, from television shows and advertisements to food, clothing, and even architecture. They explored how culture speaks, not just through language, but through symbols and signs embedded in daily life. In feminism, post-colonial theory, and queer studies, academics reinterpreted Saussure's structures to understand how identities are constructed, reinforced, and sometimes subverted through language. Even in computer science, aspects of structural linguistics helped develop natural language processing, the very technology that allows machines to read, interpret, and generate human speech. Saussure today. What makes Saussure's legacy so powerful is that it continues to evolve. His theories were never a fixed set of answers. Instead, they opened the door to new kinds of questions. Questions about the relationship between form and meaning, between individual and system, between sound and thought. Many universities today still teach his concepts as part of core linguistics courses. Students are introduced to the signifier and the signified, to langue and parole, to the structural relationships that define meaning. But they are also encouraged to challenge, update, and question his models, just as Derrida, Barthes, and others once did. Saussure has become less of a rule giver and more of a starting point, a foundation upon which new theories are built. Even his students' course in general linguistics is now studied not just for its content, but for its form, how it was assembled, what it left out, and how it reflects the thinking of a man who was always seeking, always questioning. A quiet revolution. Saussure never enjoyed the fame of a public intellectual. He didn't write a best-selling book during his life. He didn't tour lecture halls or engage in public debates. Yet his quiet revolution reshaped the way we think about language and through language, about ourselves. He showed us that speech is not merely a tool for expressing thought. It is the very structure that shapes thought. He taught us that the invisible rules of communication matter just as much as the words we say. Perhaps his greatest insight was this: meaning is not fixed. It depends on relationships. It shifts with time, with culture, with context. In a world that is constantly changing, that is a powerful and humbling truth. Final reflections. Ferdinand de Saussure remains one of the rare thinkers whose work continues to inspire both scientists and poets, both analysts and dreamers. His theories are as useful to a linguist studying endangered languages as they are to a novelist exploring identity and memory. For learners of English and learners of all languages, his legacy is especially meaningful. He reminds us that language is not just about vocabulary and grammar. It is about connection, interpretation, and the silent rules that make understanding possible. In the end, Saussure may not have sought fame, but he left us with something far more lasting, a new way to listen, to read, and to make sense of the world around us. His story began in quiet classrooms and modest notebooks, but its echoes reach into every field where words matter. And as long as we continue to explore how meaning is made, his legacy will continue to grow. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.